Hi everyone, welcome to Difference Frames the World, a channel to see the world from a different angle. Today, we discuss the relationship between the United States and China after Chinese President Xi Jinping visited the United States from November 14 to 17 to meet with his U.S. counterpart and attend the 30th informal meeting of leaders of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. It was the second face-to-face meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden, and the Chinese leader's first visit to the States after Biden became the U.S. president. With the 2024 U.S. elections approaching, more risks and turbulence will affect the relations between Beijing and Washington. According to what happened during previous elections, U.S. politicians tend to point fingers at China to attract more eyeballs of their potential supporters. The San Francisco meeting released positive signals to the outside world, showing the two world powers are willing to solve problems. The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States, the two most important countries in the world nowadays, was regarded as one of the most important diplomatic events in current international relations. China and the U.S. are not merely themselves. Instead, they represent two blocs that confront each other. Since Donald Trump became the U.S. president in 2017, China and the U.S. have been at war in various fields, particularly technology. Neither the U.S. nor China has won the tech war, and both have suffered. Both nations feel the pain and want to change the situation. For quite a while before the second face-to-face meeting between Chinese and U.S. leaders during the Biden administration's tenure, there have been frequent high-level interactions between Beijing and Washington. Before the meeting between the two national leaders, U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen spent 2 days talking with Chinese officials in the field of the economy, and a series of working consultations have recently been held between China and the U.S. in the areas of climate change, maritime affairs, foreign policy, and even arms control. In recent years, such a high frequency of interaction between the two sides in a short period is rare. It is more than just paving the way for a meeting between Biden and his Chinese counterpart in San Francisco. The two countries need to sit down to break the ice. It is becoming increasingly urgent for the United States to restart talks with China in many areas, especially against the backdrop of the Ukraine war and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The U.S. cannot simultaneously deal with the Ukraine crisis, the Middle East conflict and the Asia-Pacific challenge, so it must ease the tension between Beijing and Washington. Israel is America's core interest, 10 times more important than Taiwan. Biden knows it, and so does his old pal from China. When President Xi Jinping says China's unification is unstoppable, Joe Biden immediately reaffirms that the U.S. does not support Taiwan's independence. The Biden administration has to initiate communication with China and maintain stability in the relationship. The resumption of dialogue between China and the United States in many areas will help stabilize the relationship between the two countries and even the structural stability of the global environment. The U.S. has no choice but to admit that China plays a vital role in determining the direction of the bilateral relationship and global stability, so it has to talk with Beijing. We can hardly believe the talk in San Francisco between the two national leaders will significantly improve the relations between China and the U.S., just as we pointed out in previous videos that the first meeting between President Xi Jinping and Biden in Indonesia last time could not ease the tension between the two countries. On November 25, 2023, only 10 days after the summit, USS Hopper, a guided missile destroyer, broke into China's Xixia territorial waters, also known as Paracel Islands in the west. The warship was initially cruising near the Philippine Sea, where the United States and the Philippines had just ended their joint patrol in the South China Sea. The Chinese Navy issued a severe warning and drove the USS Hopper away, showing that the tension between the Chinese and U.S. armies was not relieved after the summit. The White House also confirmed that the Biden administration will continue to sell weapons to Taiwan, even though the U.S. president affirmed many a time that he does not support Taiwan's independence. The U.S. is now the divided states of America, not the United States of America anymore. Anything Biden promises does not count. With Donald Trump possibly re-entering the White House in 2025, Biden's influence will weaken when his last day in the White House is approaching. 2024 will be a domestic political turmoil year in the United States. Republicans and Democrats will blame China in the name of electoral interests. Pointing fingers at China is political correctness, and we can expect China to fight back feverishly in the coming year. The talks in San Francisco can only serve as a buffer to alleviate the impending tsunami and cannot solve the problems between the two sides. Even though it is least likely for the US and China to return to the expected relationship as some analysts hope, China needs such an opportunity to avoid a miscalculation and even a potential conflict with the US. China's state media and foreign ministry applauded highly for the success of the meeting, but the US showed a different picture to the world. When asked whether he still holds the same view that President Xi Jinping is a dictator, as he said in June, Joe Biden did not give a satisfactory answer the Chinese side expects. The readout from the White House also disclosed the vast difference between China and the United States. Joe Biden particularly emphasizes that the United States and China compete, instead of cooperating, saying that the US will continue to invest in the sources of American strength at home and align with allies and partners worldwide. America's allies and partners worldwide do not include China, and Beijing is positioned as a competitor, if not a rival. Joe Biden emphasized that the US always stood up for its interests, values, partners, and allies. Among America's allies and partners is not Beijing but Taiwan, a card the US would not give up quickly. Notably, the US has kept its One China policy the same as always, implying it does not agree with President Xi Jinping's One China principle. Washington does not make any compromise on selling arms to Taiwan. The summit only avoids a possible collision between the two world powers, but does not open a door for the two countries to cooperate. The so-called achievements made are ignorable. They just put things back on track. For instance, the resumption of communications between the US and Chinese armies aims to avoid potential confrontation instead of easing the tension between the two sides in the Asia-Pacific. The US will continue its navigation freedom, however far the waters are from America's homeland. The US does not forget to point fingers at China's human rights issues in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, and it reaffirms its Taiwan policy despite Beijing's disagreements. The summit was more like a repose between China and the US, aiming to prevent a confrontation. Neither the United States nor China can afford a hot war. In the past several years, both countries suffered an economic slowdown for various reasons, so they must ease the tension in some areas. China and the US need each other, and the world will benefit from a stable relationship between Beijing and Washington. China's state media says China and the US reached a consensus in over 20 areas, but the world is watching whether the US will keep its word. Interestingly, both the US and China state in their readouts that their national leaders say something respectively, but no one points out whether the other party hears his words or not. It appears that President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping, seemingly deaf, talked to the air for 4 hours, expecting no response from the audience.